The Paykan was Iran's car, not metaphorically, literally. Produced domestically from a 1960s British design, built in Iranian factories, driven by Iranian families, operating as Tehran's shared taxis for decades. By 1992, there were hundreds of thousands of them on the city's roads. Boxy, reliable, slightly underpowered, unmistakable. Every Tehran resident knew the sound of a Paykan engine. Every Tehran resident had sat in the worn back seat of one, watching the city pass through a window that didn't always close fully. The Paykan was infrastructure, as fundamental to Tehran's functioning as its water pipes or its electrical grid. And like all infrastructure, it was invisible in the way that only the things you absolutely depend on can be invisible. You don't look at a Paykan. You get in it. You state your destination. You pay your fare. You get out. This transaction happened millions of times a day across Tehran, without thought, without scrutiny, without any friction at all. The shared taxi system was unregulated, unlicensed in any meaningful sense, and completely woven into the fabric of the city's daily life. It was, in every way that mattered, perfect cover for anyone who understood how it worked, and he understood exactly how it worked. The shared taxi system worked like this. A driver, anyone with a Paykan and knowledge of the routes, would move along a fixed corridor through the city, calling his destination through the window. Passengers going in that direction would flag him down, state where they were getting off, and be told yes or no, depending on whether their stop was on the route. If yes, they got in, often alongside 2 or 3 other passengers already occupying the seats, strangers sharing a small moving space for 10 or 20 minutes before dispersing into the city. No receipt, no name, no record. The driver was not officially licensed. The route was not officially assigned. The fare was understood rather than metered. Nothing about the transaction created any paper trail because nothing about the transaction passed through any official system at all. This was not corruption. It was simply how the city moved, how it had always moved. The formal public transport system was inadequate. The private taxi system was expensive. The shared Paykan taxi was cheap, fast, reliable, and everywhere. And it operated in a complete informational vacuum that made it, for anyone who wanted to use it for something other than transportation, essentially invisible. He didn't need to disguise himself. He just needed a Paykan. The investigators, who eventually pieced together his method, established that he used stolen taxis. Not always the same taxi, different vehicles, acquired through methods that have never been fully documented, operated for a night and then abandoned. This detail, when it finally emerged, explained something that had confused the women's network in its early attempts to make sense of the rumor. Why had nobody identified the car? Because there was no single car to identify. Why had no driver come forward? Because the driver wasn't a driver in any traceable sense. The vehicle was real. The driver was real. But the connection between them lasted only as long as necessary, and then it dissolved, and the taxi was left somewhere in the city, and in the morning it was just a Paykan on a curb, indistinguishable from 10,000 other Paykans on 10,000 other curbs. The genius, if that word can be applied without glamorizing, was that he was not inserting something foreign into the city system. He was using the system exactly as it was designed to be used, by exactly the kind of person the system expected. A man, a Paykan, a route, a passenger. The city had no mechanism for questioning any of these things. He had identified that absence of mechanism years before anyone else noticed it was there. The selection criterion was simple and devastating in its simplicity. A woman alone, after dark, at a point in the city where the surrounding streets were empty enough to offer no witnesses worth worrying about. He drove the routes at the hours when this combination was most likely, late evening, when the women who worked or studied were making their way home, when the streets had thinned but not emptied, when a Paykan moving slowly was unremarkable. He would slow for a woman who was alone. If another passenger was already in the car, he would often pass. The specific vulnerability he was targeting was the combination of solitude and movement, a woman in transit, between the safety of one fixed point and another, dependent on a stranger's vehicle to complete the journey. The Women's Network had identified this in its way, which is why the informal system that emerged told women not to take empty taxis, not to be the only passenger. But this advice assumed the taxi was what it appeared to be. It assumed the other passengers, if present, were what they appeared to be. It assumed the route being offered was the route that would be taken. These assumptions were reasonable. They were also wrong, in specific cases, in ways that the Women's Network had no way to verify from the outside of a moving car on a dark street. The investigators determined that the deviation from the stated route happened gradually, not immediately, not in the first minutes of the journey when a passenger would have been alert and the surrounding streets still familiar. The route he took would match the expected route long enough for vigilance to soften, long enough for the passenger to begin the mental transition from the anxious alertness of getting into an unknown car to the relative ease of being in motion toward home. Then the deviation, small at first, explicable, a detour around a road closure perhaps, or a traffic adjustment, nothing that would demand immediate protest. By the time the route was undeniably wrong, by the time the streets outside the window were unfamiliar and the lights were thinning and the other buildings had receded into darkness, the car was already somewhere where protest would not easily be heard. The city's outskirts in 1992 were not the populated outskirts of a later Tehran. They were places where the urban grid simply ended, where the roads became tracks, where 12 million people and all their noise were somewhere behind you and receding. This was where he took them, where the city couldn't see. He wore black. This detail, present in every account that eventually surfaced, consistent across all documented testimony, carries more weight than it might initially seem. In 1992, Tehran, a man in black clothing at night was not unusual. Black was common. Dark clothing was common. The city's palette after dark was itself predominantly dark. The manteaus, the jackets, the coats. He was not wearing a disguise. He was wearing what the city wore. The black was camouflage precisely because it wasn't camouflage. It was simply what was there, what blended, what allowed a figure to move through sodium-lit streets without the specific visibility that any other color choice might have created. This is what made him so difficult to describe in the early accounts, in the rumors, in the fragmentary reports that would eventually reach investigators. What did he look like? He looked like the night. He looked like the streets. He looked like the hundreds of men in dark clothing moving through a dark city at dark hours. He had made himself into what the city already was, and the city, enormous and indifferent and full of people going to and from their own lives, had not noticed him moving through it, had no reason to, had been given no tools to. Tehran in 1992 had a specific geography of vulnerability. The city was enormous, one of the largest in the Middle East, but its enormity was concentrated. The dense urban core, with its apartment blocks and markets and traffic and witnesses, gave way at the edges to something thinner, to neighborhoods where the buildings were lower and more scattered, to areas where the streetlights became unreliable, where the roads lost their names, where the transition from city to not city happened in the space of a few hundred meters. These edges were known to the people who lived near them. They were not, generally, known to the women who were being transported through them in the back of a car following a route they'd trusted was taking them home. The city's women had developed their own internal geography of the dangerous, certain streets, certain hours, certain degrees of solitude. But this geography was built on experience and accumulated knowledge, and it couldn't map territory that had been made dangerous by someone who had specifically chosen it for its absence from any existing mental map of danger. He operated at the edge of what the city knew about itself, in the spaces between the familiar and the unmapped. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Karimi. He was 43 years old, a detective assigned to a division that handled missing persons cases in South Tehran. He had been a detective for 16 years. He had seen things that had settled into him the way difficult things settle into people who encounter them professionally, not forgotten, not resolved, simply carried and managed. In December 1992, Karimi had begun to notice something, not a pattern, not yet, not officially, something more preliminary than a pattern, a frequency, a type of report appearing with a consistency that the filing system he worked within was not designed to recognize as significant. Women missing. Last known location, in a taxi. The reports came from different districts. Different officers had taken them. They sat in different files in a system organized by geography rather than by the type of incident. Nobody had assembled them in one place. Karimi was not sure yet that there was anything to assemble, but the frequency was there, and Karimi had been a detective long enough to know that frequency was the first language of pattern. And pattern was the first language of something that needed to be named. He pulled another file, then another. He stayed at his desk until the building was quiet. By January 1993, Karimi had assembled 7 reports that shared the core elements. 7 was not a number that the system he worked within treated as alarming. Missing persons reports accumulated constantly in a city of 12 million, and 7, over the course of 2 months, in a city that size, fell within the statistical noise that the system was calibrated to absorb. But Karimi was not looking at the number in the context of the system's calibrations. He was looking at it in the context of the specific combination of elements these 7 shared. The shared taxi element, the evening or night timing, the south and southwest districts of the city. The women traveling alone. 7 instances of this specific combination across different reporting officers, in different files, in a 2-month period. He knew that his 7 was not the full number. Missing persons reports were inconsistently filed. Some families didn't report. Some reports had been filed and lost in the system. The real number was higher than 7. He didn't know how much higher. He would spend the next several months trying to find out. And the answer, when it came, would be worse than the number he'd started with. It always was. While Karimi assembled his files in the evening quiet of a South Tehran government office, the city continued at full volume. The taxis ran, the university corridors filled and emptied, the factories finished their shifts, the markets opened and closed, the mosques called the faithful 5 times through the loudspeakers that Tehran's soundscape was built around. 12 million lives doing what 12 million lives do, proceeding, persisting, generating the enormous forward momentum of a city that has survived a revolution and a war and will survive whatever comes next. Because cities don't stop. Because stopping is not something cities know how to do. Inside this momentum, the women's network carried its information quietly. Inside this momentum, the taxi system moved its millions of passengers through their days and evenings. Inside this momentum, somewhere in the south of the city, a detective with 7 files was trying to turn a frequency into a pattern, and a pattern into something that had a name and a face. And somewhere else in the same city, wearing black, driving a Paykan that was not his, the man the city had not named was watching the evening routes thin, and choosing his hour and waiting for a woman who was alone and needed to get home. The taxi system was not broken. This is important to understand. It was working exactly as it had always worked, efficiently, cheaply, moving people through a city too large for its official transport infrastructure. The flaw was not in the system. The flaw was in the assumption that a system built on trust and regularity and the reasonable expectation that a driver offering a route would take that route. The assumption that such a system was safe for everyone who used it. It was safe for most people, most of the time. That most is the thing that systems are built around. That most is the thing that makes infrastructure possible. You build for the common case. But the common case was not the case for the women who got into the wrong paycon on the wrong night. For them, the system's efficiency was not a feature. It was the mechanism of what happened to them. Next week, the lie. The moment when the institution that was supposed to find the truth did the opposite, and what it cost the city when the wrong person was named.